The city lights shimmered against Avalon's endless bustle, but amidst the chaos stood a boy, clutching a battered candy box. His eyes, wide, desperate, searching, told a story of survival. Who was he waiting for? And why did he seem so lost? Across town, Patrick Greaves, a relentless corporate lawyer, celebrated another career triumph. His life was precision, ambition, and control. But what happens when a man consumed by success collides with a moment that could unravel everything he knows? Two lives, worlds apart, are about to intersect in ways neither could foresee. What connects this lonely boy to a man who has it all? And what truths will emerge under Avalon's glowing streetlights? The answers lie in a journey of redemption and unexpected bonds. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching this story from. Is it cold there? Brew yourself a warm cup of tea and gather with your loved ones to enjoy today's story together. Don't forget to hit subscribe to enjoy more amazing stories. Monday mornings in Avalon City were always bustling, and for Patrick Greaves, a high-profile corporate lawyer, they began with precision and purpose. Patrick lived on the top floor of a luxurious high-rise overlooking the heart of the city, his mornings orchestrated down to the minute. Dressed sharply in a custom-tailored suit and clutching an expensive leather briefcase, he strode through the lobby with a brisk nod to the doorman, his polished shoes clicking on the marble floor. The city outside was alive with energy, the hum of engines and chatter of pedestrians forming a chaotic symphony. For Patrick, however, the world was noise he filtered out. His focus was on the day ahead, a crucial negotiation with a multinational client that could elevate his firm's reputation. His phone buzzed, and without breaking stride, he glanced at the screen, mentally calculating how long it would take to reach the office. Turning onto a quieter street to shave off time, Patrick's path was suddenly blocked. A young boy, no older than 10, stood on the sidewalk holding a small, battered box of candies. His clothes were faded and ill-fitting, his face streaked with grime, but his wide brown eyes held a spark of hope. "Sir, would you like to buy some candies?" "They're for my school fundraiser," the boy said, his voice tinged with nervousness. Patrick barely slowed, his icy blue eyes narrowing in irritation. "Not interested," he muttered, attempting to step around the boy. But the child shifted slightly, unintentionally blocking his way again. "Please, sir, just one box?" the boy pleaded, holding out the candies. Patrick's patience snapped. With a sharp movement, he pushed past the boy, the briefcase in his hand accidentally knocking the candy box from his grip. The contents spilled onto the pavement, brightly colored wrappers scattering like fallen leaves. "Watch where you're going," Patrick barked, his tone cutting. He barely registered the boy's startled gasp as he bent to pick up the scattered sweets. Without another glance, Patrick continued on his way, the image of the boy already fading from his mind. Behind him, the boy crouched on the ground, carefully gathering the candies back into the battered box. His hands trembled slightly, and unshed tears glistened in his eyes. It wasn't the first time he had faced rejection, but the man's harshness cut deeper than most. The world seemed so indifferent, and today was just another reminder. By the time Patrick arrived at the towering glass facade of his law firm, Greaves and Associates, the incident was already forgotten. He stepped into the elevator, greeted by his assistant Marcy, who handed him a meticulously prepared briefing file. "Good morning, Mr. Greaves," she said. "Your meeting with Global Core Industries begins in 15 minutes. Everything is set in conference room 3. Patrick nodded curtly. "Excellent," he replied, flipping through the file as the elevator ascended. His mind was already immersed in the legal intricacies of the contract, his earlier encounter with the boy erased by his tunnel vision. Unbeknownst to Patrick, that brief, harsh interaction would soon return to him in ways he could never anticipate. For the boy, whose name was Mason, it wasn't just another rejection. It was a moment that would forever shape how he viewed the world. And for Patrick, it was the start of an unexpected journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself, about success, and about what truly mattered. Patrick Greaves sat at the long mahogany conference table in one of the firm's sleek, glass-walled meeting rooms. The negotiation with Global Core Industries was in full swing, but his attention, usually razor-sharp, was faltering. Despite the precise legal arguments and sharp counterpoints he delivered, a faint image tugged at the corners of his mind. The young boy on the sidewalk, his trembling hands gathering the scattered candies. "Mr. Greaves?" A voice pulled Patrick back. Across the table, Global Corps' lead attorney was eyeing him expectantly. "Your thoughts on the final clause?" Patrick blinked, regaining his composure. "The clause is acceptable as written, but I'd suggest a minor amendment to reflect equitable distribution of liabilities." He gestured to the document, confident in his words. But as the meeting continued, he found himself unable to fully shake the boy's pleading gaze. 2 hours later, the negotiation concluded successfully, with handshakes exchanged and contracts signed. Patrick returned to his office, a sprawling space adorned with modern art and a breathtaking view of Avalon City's skyline. As he sank into his leather chair, his assistant, Marcy, entered with a fresh cup of coffee. "Excellent work, Mr. Greaves," she said, placing the cup on his desk. "One of your best performances, as always." Patrick offered a faint smile, though his mind was elsewhere. "Any messages?" Marcy hesitated. "Yes, actually. A Nathan Carter called. He said it was urgent." Patrick froze, the name stirring memories he had long buried. Nathan Carter, his best friend from law school, the man who had once been closer to him than a brother, sharing late-night study sessions and grand dreams of reshaping the legal world. But their paths had diverged after graduation, Patrick to the relentless pursuit of corporate success, and Nathan to a quieter life as a family lawyer. Their occasional calls had dwindled over the years, fading into silence. "Nathan," Patrick murmured, more to himself than to Marcy. He sounded distressed. Marcy added carefully, "Should I call him back for you?" Patrick shook his head, already reaching for the phone. "No, I'll handle it." The line rang twice before a voice Patrick hadn't heard in over a decade answered, rougher and wearier than he remembered. "Hello?" "Nathan, it's Patrick," he said, his tone uncertain. "Marcy said you called." There was a pause, long enough that Patrick wondered if the call had dropped. Then Nathan's voice returned, a mix of relief and apprehension. "Patrick, I didn't think you'd call back." Patrick felt a pang of guilt at the unspoken weight in those words. "Of course I did. What's going on?" Marcy said it was urgent. Another pause. Then Nathan's voice cracked, raw with emotion. "It's Mason, my son. He's been missing for 3 years." Patrick sat up straighter, the words landing like a blow. 3 years? "Nathan, why didn't you tell me earlier?" "I tried," Nathan said, his voice heavy with bitterness and exhaustion. "At first, I called. But you were always busy, meetings, cases. Eventually, I stopped trying." Patrick felt a sharp stab of guilt. He had ignored so many calls from Nathan over the years, always telling himself he'd call back when he had time. A time that never came. I'm sorry, Nathan. I had no idea." "It's not about guilt," Nathan replied, his voice steadying. "I'm desperate, Patrick. The police gave up long ago. Mason's all I have left, and I need your help." Patrick swallowed hard. "Of course. Anything. Tell me everything." Nathan hesitated, then began. "Mason was only 7 when he disappeared. My wife, Clara, had passed away the year before, and it was just the 2 of us. One night, I came home late from a case to find him gone. The police said there was no sign of foul play. Just vanished." Patrick listened, his mind racing. Nathan's grief was palpable, but something else began to gnaw at him. "What does he look like now?" he asked cautiously. "He's 10 now," Nathan said softly. "Brown hair, thin frame. He's got these bright brown eyes, and a habit of biting his lip when he's nervous." Patrick's breath caught. The description was hauntingly familiar. Could it be? No, it had to be a coincidence. Yet the memory of the boy on the street that morning was suddenly vivid, down to the way he had bitten his lip as he picked up the scattered candies. "Nathan," Patrick said carefully, "I think I might have seen him." "What?" Nathan's voice surged with hope. "Where?" "This morning," Patrick admitted, his voice tight. "There was a boy on the street selling candies. Brown hair, thin, about 10. I didn't I didn't realize. Patrick could hear Nathan's breathing quicken. Patrick, if it's him, if there's even a chance, it's more than I've had in years. You have to find him. I will, Patrick promised. I'll start looking right away. As he hung up, Patrick grabbed his coat and headed for the door, his heart pounding. For the first time in years, he felt something he had buried long ago. Fear, not for a case, but for a boy who might just be Nathan's lost son. He had no idea that the decision to help would not only change Nathan's life, but transform his own in ways he could never imagine. Patrick Greaves pushed through the revolving doors of his office building, the cold air of Avalon City hitting his face like a slap. The polished, composed attorney was gone, replaced by a man on a mission. His earlier indifference now gnawed at him, the boy's image vivid in his mind. He hailed a cab, barking directions to the driver. The bustling streets blurred as they sped toward the corner where Patrick had encountered the boy that morning. His heart raced, thoughts tumbling over each other. Could it really be Nathan's son? What were the chances? Yet the details Nathan described, brown hair, thin frame, and those unmistakable nervous gestures, left little room for doubt. When the cab pulled to a stop, Patrick threw a bill at the driver and stepped onto the sidewalk. The corner was busier now, crowded with midday pedestrians and street vendors. He scanned the area, his sharp eyes darting between faces. There was no sign of the boy. Patrick walked along the block, searching every nook and cranny. He checked the nearby alleys, peered into small shops, and even questioned a vendor. There was a boy here earlier, Patrick said, his tone urgent. Selling candies. About 10 years old, brown hair. The vendor shook his head. Lots of kids come through here. Sorry. Patrick clenched his jaw, frustration mounting. He retraced his steps to the corner where they had first crossed paths. Standing still for a moment, he let his gaze sweep over the area again. And then he saw him. Sitting on the steps of an old, run-down building across the street was the boy. The battered candy box rested beside him, its contents still jumbled. His shoulders were hunched, and his head was bowed, his small figure exuding a quiet defeat that made Patrick's chest tighten. Patrick hesitated. How was he supposed to approach him? The memory of his earlier harshness burned in his mind. Taking a deep breath, he crossed the street, slowing his pace as he neared the boy. Hey, Patrick said softly, kneeling a few feet away to meet the boy's eye level. The boy looked up sharply, his brown eyes wary. Recognition flickered, followed by fear. He clutched the candy box tightly, as if preparing to bolt. I'm sorry, Patrick began, his voice gentle but firm. About earlier. I shouldn't have pushed you. I was in a hurry, and I wasn't thinking. That wasn't right. The boy didn't respond, his eyes scanning Patrick's face for sincerity. He stayed frozen, gripping the box like a lifeline. What's your name? Patrick tried again, keeping his tone steady. The boy hesitated, his lips pressed together, then mumbled, Mason. Patrick's breath caught. The name hit him like a jolt of electricity, confirming what he had already suspected. Mason, he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. He couldn't believe it. Nathan's son was right here in front of him. Mason shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure what to make of Patrick's reaction. Why do you care? He asked, his voice defensive. Patrick's mind raced. He needed to tread carefully. Because, he said, choosing his words with care, I think I might know someone who's been looking for you. Someone who cares a lot about you. Mason's expression changed instantly. Hope flickered across his face, quickly replaced by suspicion. No one's looking for me, he said firmly, his voice edged with bitterness. If they cared, they wouldn't have left me. Patrick's heart ached at the boy's words. He could see the pain etched into every line of Mason's small face, the guarded look of a child who had been let down too many times. I understand why you'd feel that way, Patrick said softly. But I promise, this person hasn't stopped looking. He loves you more than you know. Mason looked away, his fingers gripping the edge of the box. Why are you here? You don't even know me. Patrick hesitated before answering. Because I was wrong earlier, and because I think I can help. The boy studied him for a long moment, his brown eyes searching for something, truth, perhaps, or reassurance. Finally, he sighed. Help how? First, Patrick said, gesturing to the box of candies. Let's get you something to eat. Then we'll figure the rest out. What do you say? Mason hesitated, his small fingers twitching nervously. I don't have money, he muttered. Patrick shook his head. That's on me. You don't need to worry about that. Reluctantly, Mason nodded, and Patrick felt a wave of relief. He had made the first breakthrough. As they stood and walked toward a nearby cafe, Patrick couldn't help but feel a mix of determination and guilt. This boy, this lost, hurting child, was Nathan's son. For now, he would focus on the immediate task, ensuring Mason was safe. But deep down, Patrick knew this was just the beginning of a much larger journey, one that would challenge him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The cafe was warm and bustling, a stark contrast to the cold streets outside. Patrick Greaves watched as Mason hunched over his bowl of soup, eating quickly but carefully, as if he didn't want to waste a single drop. Patrick had ordered him a sandwich and a cup of hot chocolate as well, though Mason hadn't touched those yet. Slow down, Patrick said gently, trying to sound more like a concerned adult and less like a scolding parent. Mason glanced up briefly, his brown eyes guarded, before returning to his soup. Patrick sighed and leaned back in his chair, observing the boy more closely. His clothes were threadbare, his sneakers falling apart at the seams. His face was pale, and his fingers, gripping the spoon, were raw and chapped. This wasn't just a rough patch, this was survival. So, Patrick began, keeping his tone light. You said your name's Mason. Do you live around here? Mason froze for a moment, then shrugged without looking up. Sort of. What does sort of mean? Patrick asked, trying to sound casual. It means I don't live anywhere, Mason muttered. His tone was defiant, but there was a flicker of vulnerability underneath. Patrick's chest tightened. No family? No one to stay with? Mason put down his spoon and pushed the bowl away slightly, his appetite clearly fading. Nope, just me. Patrick hesitated. He didn't want to push too hard, but he needed to understand the situation. How long have you been on your own? Mason glanced up sharply, his eyes narrowing. Why do you care? The question stung, but Patrick didn't flinch. Because I think you deserve better than this. And because I know someone who's been looking for you. A long time? Mason's expression hardened. Nobody's looking for me. That's not true, Patrick replied firmly. Your father. My father doesn't want me. Mason's voice rose, drawing a few glances from nearby tables. He bit his lip, his small fists clenched on the table. If he did, he wouldn't have left me. He wouldn't have sent me away. Patrick's heart sank. Mason, he said softly, leaning forward, I don't think that's what happened. You don't know anything, Mason shot back, his voice trembling with anger and pain. He said I was a mistake. The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. Patrick stared at the boy, stunned by the depth of his hurt. How could Nathan's son believe something so devastating? What had happened to make him think this way? Patrick took a slow breath, steadying himself. Listen to me, he said, his voice calm but firm. I know your father. He's been looking for you for years. He loves you more than anything. Mason looked away, his jaw tight. You're lying. I'm not, Patrick insisted, and I can prove it. But first, I need to make sure you're safe. Mason stayed silent, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Patrick waited, giving him time. Finally, the boy muttered, I'm fine. You're not fine, Patrick said gently but firmly. And that's okay. But you can't stay out there by yourself. It's not safe. Mason finally met his eyes, his defiance fading into exhaustion. I don't have anywhere else. Patrick hesitated, then made a decision. You can come with me. Just for tonight. I have a guest room, and you'll have a warm bed and food. Tomorrow, we'll figure out the next steps. Mason frowned, clearly skeptical. Why would you do that? You don't even know me. Because I want to help, Patrick said simply. And because no one should be out here alone, especially not a kid. Mason looked down at his hands, biting his lip again. Patrick could see the internal struggle on his face. Years of distrust battling against a fragile hope. After a long moment, Mason nodded slowly. Okay, just for tonight. Patrick felt a wave of relief. All right, let's get your things. They left the cafe and walked through the streets, Patrick letting Mason lead. As they approached the edge of the neighborhood, the surroundings grew grimmer. Abandoned buildings, broken windows, graffiti-streaked walls. Finally, Mason stopped in front of a crumbling structure. This is it, he said quietly. Patrick stared at the building, his heart sinking. You've been staying here? Mason shrugged. It's better than the streets. Inside, the air was damp and smelled of mold. Mason led him to a corner where a thin mattress lay on the floor, covered with a frayed blanket. A small pile of clothes and a battered backpack sat nearby. Patrick crouched down, running his fingers over the blanket. He couldn't imagine anyone, let alone a child, living like this. Mason, he said softly, you can't stay here anymore. The boy crossed his arms, his posture defensive. I don't have a choice. You do now, Patrick said firmly. Pack your things. Let's go. Mason hesitated but finally nodded, gathering his meager belongings. As they walked back toward Patrick's car, the boy's shoulders sagged under the weight of his backpack. Patrick placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, earning a quick, wary glance. Just for tonight, Mason reminded him. Just for tonight, Patrick agreed, though he already knew he wouldn't let the boy slip away so easily. As they drove toward Patrick's apartment, he glanced at Mason in the passenger seat, his small frame slouched against the door. For the first time in years, Patrick felt a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with courtrooms or contracts. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he was certain of one thing. He couldn't turn his back on Mason now. The early morning sunlight poured through the expansive windows of Patrick Greaves' apartment, highlighting its sleek, minimalist design. Yet, Patrick barely noticed the polished surroundings as he stood by the kitchen counter, gripping a steaming cup of coffee. His mind was elsewhere, consumed by the events of the previous day. In the guest room, Mason was still asleep, curled up on the oversized bed. He had looked so small and fragile when Patrick tucked him in the night before, his defenses briefly lowered after leaving behind the cold, damp building he had called home. Patrick felt a pang of guilt. How had a child been forced to endure such a life? With a deep breath, he reached for his phone. It was time to call Nathan. The phone rang twice before Nathan's voice came through, groggy but laced with anxiety. Patrick? Did you find him? I did, Patrick said, his voice steady but soft. Nathan, I found Mason. There was silence on the other end, followed by a sharp intake of breath. Is he okay? Where is he? He's here with me, Patrick replied. He's safe, but Nathan, he's been through a lot. We need to talk. Patrick could hear the emotion thick in Nathan's voice as he whispered, Thank God. An hour later, Patrick sat in his living room, watching Nathan pace back and forth. His old friend looked nothing like the confident, idealistic man Patrick had known in law school. The years had aged him. His face was lined with stress, and his shoulders slumped as though carrying an unbearable weight. I don't know where to begin, Nathan said finally, sinking into an armchair. His hands trembled as he rubbed his temples. There's so much you don't know. Patrick leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. Start with what happened the night Mason disappeared. Nathan nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the floor. It started long before that, he admitted. With Clara. Patrick stayed quiet, letting him speak. Clara was brilliant, vibrant, but she was also fragile. After Mason was born, something changed. She became distant, her moods unpredictable. At first, I thought it was just the stress of new motherhood, but it got worse. Nathan's voice cracked as he continued. She refused to get help. She said she wasn't broken and didn't need fixing. But the highs and lows, they were unbearable. One minute she'd be laughing with Mason. The next she'd lock herself in the bedroom for days. Patrick's chest tightened as he listened. He had always thought of Nathan as someone who had everything. A family, a stable career. He had never imagined the struggles lurking beneath the surface. The night Mason disappeared, Nathan said, his voice barely above a whisper. I was out getting her medication. I thought she'd stay home with him, but when I came back, they were gone. Patrick frowned. Did she take him willingly? Nathan nodded. She left a note. Said she was protecting him from me, that I didn't care about them. It wasn't rational. She was in the middle of a manic episode. Patrick leaned back, his mind racing. And after that? I searched everywhere, Nathan said, his voice raw. The police found traces of her and Mason at shelters, but they were always one step ahead. Then, 2 years ago, I got a call. She had been found. Clara had passed away. Patrick felt his stomach drop. And Mason? Nathan shook his head. There was no sign of him. I didn't know if he was alive, if he was safe. I've been searching ever since. Patrick closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the weight of the story. The guilt in Nathan's voice was palpable, but Patrick knew his friend had done everything he could. What about Mason? Nathan asked suddenly. What has he told you? Patrick hesitated. He thinks you didn't want him, that you sent him away. Nathan's face crumpled, and he buried his head in his hands. I'd never. I loved him more than anything. He was my whole world. Patrick placed a hand on Nathan's shoulder. He's been through hell, Dom. But now that we've found him, we can start to fix this. A soft voice interrupted them. What are you talking about? Both men turned to see Mason standing in the hallway, his small frame dwarfed by the oversized pajamas Patrick had lent him. His brown eyes darted between them, filled with both curiosity and fear. Nathan stood slowly. Mason! His voice was thick with emotion. It's me. It's Dad. Mason flinched, stepping back. You're not my dad. My dad didn't want me. The words hit Nathan like a blow, but he didn't waver. That's not true, Mason. I've been looking for you every day. I love you more than anything. Mason's lip quivered, and he looked at Patrick. Is he telling the truth? Patrick crouched to meet Mason's gaze. Yes, Mason. Your dad has been searching for you ever since you disappeared. He never stopped. Mason hesitated, then whispered. But Mom said... Nathan took a cautious step forward. Your mom, she was sick, Mason. She wasn't thinking clearly. But I never stopped loving you. Never. Tears welled in Mason's eyes, and Patrick's heart broke as the boy struggled to process the truth. Finally, Mason stepped toward Nathan, his movements tentative. Are you really my dad? Mason asked, his voice barely audible. Nathan dropped to his knees and opened his arms. Yes, Mason. I'm your dad, and I'll never let you go again. For a long moment, Mason stood frozen. Then, with a quiet sob, he ran into Nathan's embrace. Patrick watched, his own eyes misting, as father and son clung to each other, the weight of years apart finally lifting. The next morning in Patrick's apartment, an unusual calm settled. Mason had stayed close to Nathan, still hesitant but clearly curious about the father he had long believed abandoned him. Patrick observed the fragile moments between them, Nathan's quiet reassurances, Mason's tentative questions. It was progress, but Patrick knew it would take time for the wounds of the past to fully heal. That fragile calm shattered with the sound of the doorbell. I'll get it, Patrick said, rising from the kitchen table where they just finished breakfast. As he opened the door, he found himself face to face with a stern-looking woman in her 60s, her sharp gray eyes scrutinizing him with a mixture of disdain and impatience. She carried an air of authority, her posture rigid and her expression unyielding. Who are you? The woman demanded, her voice cold and clipped. Patrick frowned slightly. Patrick Greaves. May I ask who? Before he could finish, her gaze darted past him into the apartment. Spotting Nathan and Mason sitting together on the sofa, her face hardened further. Nathan, she said, her tone filled with icy accusation. Nathan stood, his expression a mix of surprise and dread. Margaret. Mason tensed at the name, shrinking back slightly. Patrick's lawyer instincts kicked in, and he stepped aside, letting the woman, Margaret Hartley, Clara's mother, into the apartment. She marched straight into the living room, her eyes fixed on Mason. Mason, darling, she said, softening her tone but not her posture. Come here. Mason hesitated, glancing at Nathan and then at Patrick. Margaret's eyes narrowed as she turned to Nathan. I'm taking him with me. Nathan's jaw tightened. Margaret, he's my son. And you failed him, she snapped, her voice rising. You failed Clara, and you failed Mason. Look at him, living on the streets, abandoned because you couldn't keep your family together. That's not true, Nathan said firmly, though Patrick could see the guilt flicker in his eyes. I've been searching for him for years. Years too late, Margaret retorted. If you'd been a proper father, he wouldn't have gone missing in the first place. Clara wouldn't have. Her voice broke for a moment before she regained control. She wouldn't have died. Mason flinched, curling into himself on the sofa. The room felt charged, the tension unbearable. Patrick stepped in, his voice calm and authoritative. Mrs. Hartley, perhaps we should take a step back and discuss this rationally. Margaret turned her icy gaze on him. And who are you to interfere? I'm a family friend, Patrick said smoothly, and an attorney. I'm here to make sure that everyone's best interests, especially Mason's, are considered. Then you should understand, Margaret said sharply. Mason belongs with me. I'm his grandmother, and I have every right to take him. Patrick shook his head. With all due respect, Mrs. Hartley, this isn't about rights. It's about Mason's well-being. Ripping him away from his father right now would only cause more harm. His father? Margaret scoffed, her voice dripping with disdain. This is the same man who drove Clara to her death with his neglect. That's enough, Nathan said, his voice trembling but resolute. I loved Clara. I did everything I could to help her, and I've spent every day since Mason disappeared trying to bring him home. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. And yet he ended up in an abandoned building. Some father you turned out to be. Mason stood suddenly, his voice cracking as he yelled, "Stop it! Stop fighting!" All eyes turned to him. Tears streamed down his face as he looked between Nathan and Margaret. I don't want this, he cried. I don't want you to fight over me. Patrick stepped closer, lowering his voice to a soothing tone. Mason, I know this is overwhelming, but we're trying to figure out what's best for you. Then stop yelling, Mason said, his voice trembling. Please. Margaret softened slightly, guilt flashing across her face. She knelt in front of him, her voice gentle for the first time. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I just want to make sure you're safe. Nathan stepped forward as well, his voice steady. Mason, you're my son. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you're okay. But I won't fight your grandmother in front of you. You don't deserve that. Patrick, seeing the fragile truce forming, took charge. Mrs. Hartley, if you believe custody is an issue, then I suggest we handle this legally. Fighting here only adds stress for Mason. Margaret straightened, her stern demeanor returning. Fine, she said curtly. But this isn't over, Nathan. I'll be contacting my attorney. Nathan nodded. Do what you have to, but Mason stays with me. Patrick escorted Margaret to the door. Before leaving, she turned back, her eyes softening briefly as she looked at Mason. I love you, darling. Don't forget that. When she was gone, the apartment felt heavy with silence. Mason sat on the sofa, his small body tense, his hands gripping the edge of his shirt. Nathan sat beside him, hesitant but determined. Mason, no matter what happens, I'll fight for you. I promise. Mason didn't reply but leaned into Nathan slightly, seeking quiet reassurance. Patrick watched the scene, his resolve hardening. The road ahead would be difficult, but one thing was clear. This family wasn't giving up on each other. The courtroom was filled with tension as people settled into their seats, the weight of the case pressing down on everyone present. Nathan sat at the defendant's table, his jaw tight and his hands clasped in front of him. Beside him, Patrick Greaves adjusted his tie and opened his leather-bound notebook, his demeanor calm and composed. Across the aisle sat Margaret Hartley, her stern face betraying no emotion as she whispered to her attorney. Mason sat between Nathan and Patrick, his small frame dwarfed by the high-backed chair. His wide eyes darted nervously around the room, and Patrick placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. It's going to be okay, he whispered. The bailiff called the room to order, and the judge entered, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes that swept across the room. We are here today to determine custody of Mason Reeves, she announced, her voice firm but not unkind. Both parties will have the opportunity to present their arguments. Margaret's attorney rose first, a tall, impeccably dressed man who exuded confidence. He began by painting Nathan as a negligent father, highlighting Mason's time on the streets and Clara's tragic death. Mr. Reeves failed his wife during her most vulnerable moments, the attorney declared. And as a result, he failed his son. Mason deserves a stable home, one that my client, Mrs. Hartley, can provide. Margaret nodded solemnly, her expression one of quiet determination. When it was Patrick's turn, he stood with measured confidence. Your Honor, my client, Nathan Carter, has spent every day of the last 3 years searching for his son. His efforts were relentless, driven by a father's unwavering love. Patrick presented documentation of Nathan's search, police reports, private investigator files, and even testimony from shelters that confirmed Nathan's inquiries about Mason. My client's dedication cannot be questioned, Patrick continued. What we must consider here is the truth of the circumstances. Clara Reeves struggled with untreated mental illness, which tragically affected her ability to make rational decisions. Her actions were not Nathan's failure. They were the result of a system that did not provide her the help she needed. Patrick's words hung in the air, and for the first time, Margaret's stoic mask cracked. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. The proceedings dragged on for hours, with both sides presenting their arguments. Patrick carefully rebutted each point Margaret's attorney made, showcasing Nathan's love and commitment to Mason. But the turning point came when Mason was called to testify. The courtroom fell silent as the bailiff escorted Mason to the stand. The boy's small figure seemed even smaller against the imposing backdrop of the court. Patrick met his gaze and gave him a slight nod, silently encouraging him. Mason, the judge began, her voice softening. Do you understand why you're here today? Mason nodded hesitantly. Yes, ma'am. And do you feel comfortable telling us how you feel about all this? Mason took a shaky breath, his hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. I spent a long time being angry, he said, his voice trembling. Angry at my dad because I thought he didn't want me. Angry at my mom because she took me away. And angry at myself because I didn't understand. The courtroom was utterly silent as Mason paused to collect himself. But now I know, he continued, his voice gaining strength. My dad didn't stop looking for me. He didn't give up. And he never stopped loving me. Patrick watched as Nathan's eyes filled with tears, his hands gripping the table in front of him. I want to stay with my dad, Mason said, his voice breaking slightly, because he needs me, and I need him. Margaret let out a soft sob, covering her mouth with her hand. Even her attorney looked momentarily taken aback by the boy's heartfelt words. The judge studied Mason for a long moment before nodding. Thank you, Mason. You've been very brave. When the proceedings concluded, the judge announced her decision. Having reviewed the evidence and testimony, I award full custody of Mason Reeves to his father, Nathan Carter. However, she added, turning to Margaret, I am granting visitation rights to Mrs. Hartley. Mason deserves to have as much family as possible in his life. Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, Your Honor, she said quietly. Nathan exhaled deeply, his shoulders sagging with relief. He turned to Mason, pulling him into a tight embrace. We did it, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. We're going to be okay. Patrick watched the scene, his own heart swelling with a sense of accomplishment. He had fought hard for this moment, and seeing the bond between Nathan and Mason reaffirmed why he had taken the case. As they left the courtroom together, the afternoon sun bathed them in its warm light. Mason held tightly to Nathan's hand, his steps lighter than they had been in years. Patrick walked beside them, a quiet but steadfast presence, knowing this was only the beginning of their journey. The sound of laughter echoed through Nathan Carter's modest home, a sound that had been absent for years. Mason sat cross-legged on the living room floor, his face lit up as he worked on a model airplane. Across from him, Nathan knelt, holding a tube of glue and offering pointers. It was a simple activity, but the warmth between them felt profound. From the kitchen doorway, Patrick Reeves watched the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. He had stayed for dinner after helping Nathan finalize some paperwork, and now he found himself observing the delicate rebuilding of a father-son relationship. "Looks like you're doing more supervising than building," Patrick teased as he stepped into the room. Mason glanced up with a grin. "I'm letting him help," he said, his tone playful. Nathan chuckled, a sound Patrick hadn't heard from him in years. "Generous of you, kiddo." Patrick settled onto the couch, letting the light-hearted banter wash over him. The tension that had once surrounded Mason was starting to fade, replaced by a tentative comfort in his new reality. It wasn't just the boy who was healing. Nathan, too, seemed lighter, as if the weight of years of guilt and grief had begun to lift. Later that evening, after Mason had gone to bed, Nathan and Patrick sat on the back porch, sipping coffee under the cool evening sky. The city lights shimmered in the distance, casting a soft glow over the quiet neighborhood. "I can't thank you enough, Patrick," Nathan said, his voice low but steady. "For everything, for finding Mason, for fighting for us in court, for sticking around." Patrick waved a hand dismissively. "You don't need to thank me. I just did what anyone would have done." Nathan shook his head. "No, you did more than that. You gave me a second chance. Mason and we wouldn't have made it without you." Patrick stared into his coffee, his thoughts swirling. Over the past weeks, he had become more than just an attorney for Nathan. He had become part of their family. It was an unfamiliar feeling, but one that filled a void he hadn't realized existed. "Seeing you two together," Patrick said finally, "it reminds me why I became a lawyer in the first place. To help people. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that." Nathan nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Well, you've more than made up for it." The days that followed were filled with small but meaningful milestones. Mason began to open up about his time on the streets, sharing stories of survival and fear. Nathan listened intently, his heart breaking with every detail, but vowing silently to be the support Mason needed. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Mason asked a question that caught both men off guard. "Why did Mom take me away?" Nathan set down his fork, his expression somber. "Your mom, she wasn't well, Mason. She loved you, but her illness made her believe things that weren't true. She thought she was protecting you." Mason frowned, his brow furrowed in thought. "So it wasn't because of me?" "No, buddy," Nathan said firmly. "None of it was your fault. She loved you more than anything. She just couldn't see clearly because of her illness." Mason nodded slowly, the words sinking in. Patrick watched the exchange, marveling at Nathan's patience and Mason's resilience. The boy was beginning to heal, piece by piece. One Saturday afternoon, Patrick arrived to find Nathan and Mason in the backyard, tossing a frisbee back and forth. The air was filled with laughter, and Mason's smile was brighter than Patrick had ever seen. "Hey, Patrick," Mason called out, running over to him. "You want to join?" Patrick hesitated, then shrugged off his jacket. "Why not?" For the next hour, the three of them played together, the bond between them growing stronger with each throw and catch. By the time they collapsed onto the grass, panting and laughing, Patrick felt an unfamiliar but welcome sense of belonging. "You're not half bad for a lawyer," Nathan teased, nudging Patrick with his elbow. Patrick smirked. "I'll take that as a compliment." That night, as Patrick prepared to leave, Mason tugged at his sleeve. "Thanks for everything," the boy said softly. "For helping me find my dad." Patrick knelt to meet his gaze. "You're welcome, Mason. But you and your dad did the hard part. I just helped a little." Mason grinned. "You're part of the family now, you know?" Patrick's chest tightened, the boy's words hitting him harder than he expected. "Thanks, kiddo. That means a lot." As Patrick drove home, he reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this point. He had started out as a distant, career-driven lawyer, but now he felt deeply connected to a family that wasn't his by blood but had become his by choice. For the first time in years, Patrick felt a profound sense of purpose, not in contracts or courtrooms, but in the quiet moments that truly mattered. The sun rose gently over the Reeves household, bathing the small home in warm light. It had been weeks since the court had granted Nathan full custody of Mason, and life was finally settling into a new rhythm. The once fragile bond between father and son was now growing stronger, marked by laughter, shared meals, and quiet conversations that brought them closer each day. Mason had begun school again, though the adjustment wasn't without its challenges. Nathan made sure to walk him to the bus stop each morning, offering words of encouragement. Patrick often visited in the evenings, checking in on Mason's progress and lending a hand with homework when needed. One afternoon, as Patrick arrived for dinner, he was greeted not just by Nathan and Mason, but also by an unexpected guest, Margaret Hartley. The older woman sat stiffly on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, but her demeanor lacked the icy edge Patrick remembered. "Patrick," Nathan said, gesturing to Margaret, "you remember Mrs. Hartley?" Patrick nodded politely. "Of course. It's nice to see you again." Margaret offered a small, hesitant smile. "I thought it was time I got to know my grandson and his father." Dinner that evening was a surprisingly pleasant affair. While Margaret and Nathan exchanged cautious words, Mason sat between them, visibly more relaxed than Patrick expected. Margaret's earlier hostility seemed to have softened, replaced by a quiet determination to be part of Mason's life. After dinner, as Mason showed Margaret his collection of drawings, mostly of planes, rockets, and the occasional superhero, Patrick joined Nathan on the porch. "She's trying," Nathan said, leaning against the railing. "It's not easy for her, or for me, but we're figuring it out." Patrick nodded. "For Mason's sake, it's worth it." Nathan glanced through the window, watching his mother-in-law laugh softly at one of Mason's sketches. "I never thought I'd see her like this," he admitted. "I think losing Clara, it broke something in her. But maybe this is her way of healing too." Patrick crossed his arms, his gaze thoughtful. "It's not just her healing. You're building something here, Dom. Something solid." Nathan smiled faintly. "We all are. Thanks to you." As the weeks turned into months, Mason began to blossom. He still carried scars from his time on the streets, but the once defensive boy was now opening up, his curiosity and creativity shining through. He often shared his dreams with Patrick during their tutoring sessions. "I want to be a pilot," Mason said one evening, his brown eyes sparkling with excitement. "I want to fly planes all over the world." Patrick raised an eyebrow. "A pilot, huh? Sounds ambitious." Mason grinned. "Yeah, I've been reading about how planes work. It's really cool. Did you know they're designed to handle turbulence?" Patrick chuckled. "I think you're going to handle life's turbulence just fine." Mason's expression turned thoughtful. "Do you think I can really do it?" Patrick met his gaze, his voice firm. "I don't just think you can. I know you can. And you've got your dad and your grandmother cheering you on too." The boy beamed, his confidence growing with every passing day. Meanwhile, Margaret's visits became more frequent. Though her relationship with Nathan was still tentative, she had found a role as Mason's grandmother, often bringing him books or helping with his school projects. One afternoon, she surprised Mason with a scrapbook she had made, filled with photos of Clara. "Your mom was an artist too," Margaret told him, her voice soft. "She loved to paint." Mason ran his fingers over the pages, his eyes glistening. "I wish I could have known her better." "She would have been so proud of you," Margaret said, pulling him into a gentle hug. Nathan watched from the doorway, a mixture of gratitude and sorrow in his eyes. Patrick, standing beside him, placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're doing the right thing, Dom. This is what Mason needs, a family, even if it's not perfect." As the days passed, Patrick found himself more deeply integrated into the family. Mason often referred to him as Uncle Patrick, a title that brought both amusement and pride. For Patrick, who had spent so much of his life focused on ambition and career, this newfound connection was transformative. One evening, as Patrick was leaving, Mason stopped him at the door. "Uncle Patrick?" Patrick turned, smiling. "What's up, kiddo?" "I just wanted to say thanks," Mason said, his voice sincere, "for helping me find my dad, and for helping me believe in myself." Patrick crouched to meet his gaze, his tone warm. "You don't have to thank me, Mason. You're the one who's done the hard work. I'm just glad I could be here for you." As Patrick drove home, he reflected on how much had changed since that first encounter with Mason on the street. He had come into their lives as a lawyer, but now he was something much more. For the first time in years, Patrick felt like he was part of something meaningful, a family. In the months that followed, the Reeves household became a place of hope and recovery. Nathan and Mason continued to rebuild their relationship. Margaret found her role as a grandmother, and Patrick became a trusted friend and mentor. Together, they formed an unconventional but deeply connected family, united by love and the determination to move forward. Mason's dreams of becoming a pilot became a symbol of the family's journey, proof that even after the darkest storms, there could be light and endless possibilities. The night was crisp and clear, the sky above the Reeves household stretching wide, speckled with stars. Mason sat on a blanket in the backyard, a flashlight in one hand and a constellation guide in the other. The quiet hum of the city felt distant, leaving only the whispers of the wind and the occasional chirp of crickets. "Look, there's Orion's belt," Mason said, pointing his flashlight upward. "And over there, that's Cassiopeia." Beside him, Nathan leaned back on his elbows, his face soft with a contentment that had been foreign to him for so long. "You've been doing your homework, huh?" he teased, though his voice carried pride. Patrick Reeves sat on Mason's other side, his tie discarded and sleeves rolled up, a far cry from the polished attorney who had first stumbled into their lives. He tilted his head back, following the boy's flashlight beam. "Impressive," he said. "I didn't even know Cassiopeia was a thing until you mentioned it." Mason grinned, his brown eyes glowing with excitement. "Uncle Patrick, you really need to read more. Stars are amazing. They're like maps in the sky." Nathan chuckled, but his gaze lingered on Mason, his heart full. Seeing his son so animated, so alive, felt like a second chance he didn't think he'd ever have. The three of them fell into a comfortable silence, staring up at the stars. For Patrick, the scene felt almost surreal. Months ago, his world had been confined to office towers and courtrooms, driven by endless deadlines and the chase for success. Now, he was here, part of something infinitely more meaningful. "It's funny," Patrick said after a while, his voice thoughtful. "I've spent so much of my life looking ahead, chasing the next big thing. But I think I've learned more in the past few months than I have in years." Nathan glanced at him. "Like what?" Patrick shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "Like what it means to really connect with people, to care about something other than winning a case or impressing a client." He glanced at Mason. "You've reminded me what's important." Mason looked up, his expression serious. "Like helping people?" Patrick nodded. "Exactly. And being there for the people who matter." Nathan clapped a hand on Patrick's shoulder, his gratitude evident. "You've done more than I could ever thank you for, Patrick. You didn't just help us, you became part of our family." Patrick swallowed, emotion tightening his throat. He had always prided himself on staying detached, on maintaining professional boundaries. But with Nathan and Mason, those walls had crumbled, and he wasn't sorry for it. As the night deepened, Mason's energy began to wane. He lay back on the blanket, his small body sinking into the fabric as he gazed up at the stars. "You know," he said softly, "I didn't think I'd ever have a family again. I thought I was going to be alone forever." Nathan leaned over and ruffled Mason's hair. "You'll never be alone again, buddy. I promise." Mason turned his head to look at Patrick. "And thank you, Uncle Patrick, for finding me and bringing me back to Dad." Patrick smiled, his eyes glistening. "I'm just glad I could help. But really, you and your dad did the hard part. You're both braver than I'll ever be." Mason grinned sleepily. "You're brave too. You fought for us." Nathan and Patrick exchanged a look, a shared understanding passing between them. They had both been shaped by this journey, their lives transformed by Mason's resilience and the bonds they had rebuilt. As the stars shimmered above them, the future felt vast and uncertain, but it was no longer something to fear. Together, they had faced the worst and found hope on the other side. There were still challenges ahead: Mason's healing, Nathan's rebuilding, and Patrick's continued quest for balance. But they would face them together. For Nathan, the stars symbolized redemption, a chance to be the father Mason deserved. For Patrick, they represented connection, a reminder that his life could be richer and more fulfilling than he had ever imagined. And for Mason, the stars were a map of endless possibilities, a promise that his dreams were within reach. "I think I see the Big Dipper," Mason murmured, his voice drowsy. Nathan smiled, wrapping an arm around his son. "Yeah, I see it too." Patrick lay back, letting the cool grass press against him as he gazed upward. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. The stars twinkled above them, silent witnesses to a family that had been broken and rebuilt, stronger than before. As Mason drifted to sleep under the vast night sky, Nathan and Patrick stayed beside him, united in purpose and love. Whatever the future held, they knew they would face it together. And for the first time, that was more than enough.